Greetings, this is Greg. The Grumman F8F Bearcat was too late to see combat during the Second World War. It's what I consider to be a superprop. That is to say, it's one of the planes that represents the zenith of piston-powered fighters that came out just a bit too late to see action during the war. I have a previous video on this category of airplanes which covers the North American P-51H Mustang, which was not a normal World War II Mustang. It's a different airframe. They just look similar. I also talked about Republic's XP-72 and others. I originally planned on this video covering all of the U.S. Navy superprops, but the Bearcat, for reasons which will become clear, really needs a video of its own, so here we are. Now, before we go any farther, I need to get this out of the way. The Bearcat is not an improved Wildcat, Hellcat, or anything else. This was an entirely new breed of cat, so to speak. It's hugely different from the Hellcat in terms of design philosophy and execution. Grumman's previous fighter plane, the Hellcat, was a relatively low-cost airplane by U.S. World War II fighter standards. The Hellcat was designed to be quick to produce and relatively inexpensive. This isn't to say that the Hellcat wasn't a quality airplane. It was, but certain sacrifices to performance were made in the interest of assembly line time and cost. Now this worked out really well, as initially Hellcats were around $50,000 a copy, which was a decent deal, but the price quickly dropped to about $35,000 a plane as the production was streamlined. This was at a point when Corsairs and Thunderbolts were more than double that amount. In terms of value per dollar, the Hellcat was probably the best U.S. fighter of the war. Not the best fighter overall, but in terms of bang for the buck. Heck, in 1944, even a P-40 cost more than a Hellcat, and the Hellcat was far more capable. Now, the Bearcat was another story. It was up around $83,000 a copy, even more than the famously complex and difficult to build Corsair. I think the Bearcat represented a new way of thinking and a new direction in regards to warplane economics at Grumman. I don't have a source to show this is how they were thinking at Grumman, but hear me out. If you're buying warplanes, there is a quantity versus quality equation you have to think about. Do you want to buy a few really expensive airplanes or a larger number of inexpensive but less capable airplanes? There are cases when buying a greater quantity of slightly inferior planes may be the way to go, especially if the extra expense is going to be in capability you won't need anyway. As an example, as compared with the Hellcat, the P-47 Thunderbolt is more than twice the price, but has significantly more capability at very high altitudes and a lot more range. But you have to ask, if I'm not going to be fighting up at high altitude anyway, say we're going to use these planes in an environment like the Eastern Front in Europe, where most of the combat is close to the front and at low altitude, would I rather have 8 Hellcats or 4 Thunderbolts? The answer is 8 Hellcats, no question about it, provided you've got enough pilots for them. But now think about aircraft carrier warfare. We can only fit so many planes on that carrier. So in this example, do I want 20 of the most capable fighters to deal with incoming threats, or 20 slightly inferior airplanes? I think the answer is self-evident, and when dealing with the emerging threat of kamikazes, every second started to really count, and I think Grumman made a shift towards more expensive fighters, which continued on pretty much as long as they built fighter planes. This line of thinking culminated in the F-14 Tomcat, which was at least 3 times more expensive than the F-4 Phantom it largely replaced in the Fleet Defender role. Some say the Tomcat was 10 times more expensive, but these numbers are a little tricky to pin down. It looks to me like that 10 times more expensive number comes from the package deal of Tomcats to Iran, but those included a lot more than the planes themselves. Either way, though, the Tomcat was very expensive, but it sort of makes sense when you consider what was at stake when it was launched to intercept incoming threats to the fleet. And due to space limitations on the aircraft carrier, launching, say, 3 times as many F-4 Phantoms or F-8 Crusaders or whatever simply wasn't an option. Grumman was focused on carrier aircraft, I think that's sort of how their line of thinking went, and I think it started with the Bearcat. Furthermore, by the time Bearcat development was really rolling, they were probably thinking about post-war markets for their products. I suspect they realized that in the post-war environment, they would be selling far fewer airplanes, so it makes economic sense to try and sell more expensive planes. History has shown us that of all the U.S. companies that built combat planes in World War II, Grumman was one of the most financially successful in the post-war environment. So I think they knew what they were doing when they shifted to fewer, more expensive airplanes. That's enough about my economic theories, and that's all that was, is my theory. Let's move on to the plane itself. In period publications at the time, it was said that the new Bearcat was a combination of the best features of Japanese fighters combined with the best of U.S. Navy fighters. The Bearcat wasn't mentioned all that often in period publications. All the excitement had moved over to the jets by that point. But when it was mentioned, the Japanese influence was often brought up. And there was some influence from the Japanese, but I think there was stronger influence from the German fighters and from the Corsair. Grumman wasn't operating in a vacuum. They had been looking at planes from the competition, which any prudent manufacturer would have been doing. In fact, they had on occasion had the opportunity to inspect very closely the Zero, FW-190, and of course the Corsair. Yes, I know some of these opportunities didn't happen until after design work on the Bearcat had started, but that doesn't mean that the people at Grumman hadn't seen these planes before, or that they didn't make changes during development as they learned new things. Now, it's said that the inspiration for the Bearcat came about from a conversation between Jimmy Thatch, the pilot of Thatch Weave fame, and the vice president of Grumman. Thatch explained that climb rate was of great importance to a carrier-based fighter plane, which is true. And it's very apparent that Grumman focused heavily on climb rate for the new Bearcat. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you may recall that an aircraft's maximum rate of climb is a function of the difference between power available and power required. At the time the Bearcat was in development, the most powerful engine Grumman could source to put into a fighter was the Pratt & Whitney R2800, which was the type already in use in the Hellcat and Corsair. So increasing the amount of power available in the Bearcat over those other planes didn't seem like it was possible. Even if they put in a newer and more powerful version of the R2800, it was likely that version could go into those other planes as well. So the Bearcat wasn't going to have an advantage there, at least not much of one. That leaves power required. Well, the best way to reduce power required was to lower the weight of the airplane. All airplanes are a series of compromises, so what would they be willing to sacrifice in order to decrease the weight? They didn't sacrifice armor. In fact, the Bearcat had armor that could stop 50 caliber fighter. It's one of the very few World War II fighters that had armor that tough. So no compromise was made there. Self-sealing fuel tanks add a lot of weight, but combat during the war had shown that's a sacrifice to performance worth keeping, especially with everybody throwing around incendiary or explosive ammunition. So they did use a self-sealing tank in the Bearcat, but only a single 185-gallon tank. That isn't a lot. To put that into perspective, let's think about the fleet defense mission. On takeoff and initial climb out, it's going to burn about 5 gallons a minute, or 300 gallons per hour. Shortly after takeoff, it's going to throttle back to maximum continuous power, at which point it's going to be burning around 170 gallons an hour, with occasional spikes at war emergency power back up to 280 or 300 gallons an hour. Thus, on internal fuel, a Bearcat in this type of mission has an endurance of only about 45 minutes from takeoff before the pilot has to seriously think about landing. Of course, if he's loitering at altitude, he can extend it a lot by throttling way back, flying at an economical speed, and manually leaning the mixture. Under these conditions, he can get the fuel flow down into the mid to low 40s range. The plane won't be going very fast, but this will extend the plane's endurance quite a bit. Still, the range was a big step back from the Corsair and Hellcat. It was actually a lot like the early Bf-109. This was a sacrifice they had to make in order to get the performance they wanted. I'm not saying this was specifically due to the influence from the German fighters, but going with a smaller airplane with less fuel capacity was very much the German way of doing things. Of course, the Bearcat's range could be extended with drop tanks, but remember that only works so well because once in combat with enemy fighters, you have to drop those tanks, and that means that no matter how much fuel the plane can carry in the drop tanks, its maximum distance from base in a combat mission is limited to the amount of internal fuel it carries minus whatever it used in combat. That's the reason the Thunderbolts had 370 gallons of internal fuel late in the war, and even more with the Dash N or November models. The Bearcats burn fuel at a similar rate to the Thunderbolt, but only have 185 gallons, so that was a big limitation. Now, how else did they make the plane lighter? Well, they simply made it smaller. I'll put up some numbers so you can see how small it is relative to a Hellcat or Corsair. Of course, this sort of ties into the issue of smaller fuel tanks. A smaller plane has less room for fuel. Note that the Bearcat is more than 5 feet shorter than either of the other two planes here, and it has quite a bit less wingspan as well. This decreased size contributes to the Bearcat's lower weight. It's not the only reason, but it's part of the equation. For fun, let's throw in some European airplanes. Sadly, for comparative purposes, there were no proven navalized versions of German fighters. There were some experiments, and yes, I know about the half dozen or so 109Ts. Show me a picture of one taking off or landing from a carrier and we'll talk. The Bearcat and FW-190 are actually pretty close to each other in length and wingspan, with the 109 being a little bit smaller, but I would say still in the same ballpark. So while the Bearcat's dimensions were small for a US fighter, they were about par for the course for a German fighter. If we compare weights, well, the Germans are lighter, but that's largely because they were not naval variants. No folding wings, no arresting gear, no need to reinforce the structure for the abuse of a catapult or arresting wire. Also, the Germans were pretty good at saving weight and simplifying production. In fact, the single best feature of the Bf-109 is one that's almost never mentioned. They were cheap and easy to produce. Of course, they were also pretty light, which really helped the climb rate. Next, let's throw in a Supermarine Seafire, but not just any Seafire, but the nearest thing Supermarine had to a Bearcat. This is very much a British Superprop. It's actually quite a bit faster than the Bearcat. The Seafire may look really heavy here, and it is by Seafire/Spitfire standards, but this version has the Rolls-Royce Griffon. It has dual contra-rotating props and hydraulically powered folding wings as well as all the other naval type stuff. So it's a lot heavier than a typical Spitfire, but it has the performance to make up for it. So the Bearcat is the lightest naval fighter here, but not too much heavier than the land-based FW-190A8. Size had a lot to do with that, but there's so much more. Some of the next weight reduction methods may surprise you. One of them in particular I think is absolutely insane, at least in my opinion, but you can be the judge of that. Wait till we get to it. You might want to be sitting down. Before we get to the insanity, let's talk about the engines. There were two different engines in the Bearcat. As a general rule, if it's a Dash 1 variant, it's packing the R2800-34W. If it's a Dash 2 Bearcat, it uses the 2800-30W. So the later Dash 2 Bearcat uses the lower dash number engine. I want to start off by talking about that first one, the Dash 34 used in the earlier airplane. Note that the higher dash number in this case, 34 versus 30, is the earlier engine, opposite of what they normally did. Thanks, Pratt & Whitney. So the 2800-34W was the latest and greatest of the mighty R2800s at the time. It's a very rare engine. In fact, I don't think it was ever used in any plane other than Bearcats. Here's the power chart for the Dash 34 engine. It makes 2,300 horsepower at 58 inches of manifold pressure and at 2,800 RPM. That by itself isn't news. The P-47s with earlier R2800s were making the same amount of power at the same manifold pressure, but at only 2,700 RPM, and 2 years earlier. The difference here is that the Bearcat's engine is doing this without water injection. I don't know what changes they made to these later dash numbers used in Bearcats. These are such rare engines that I can't find any specifics on them. I do know, of course, there's still 18 cylinders, same bore and stroke, but I suspect the valve timing changed slightly along with improved superchargers, but I'm not sure. Of course, 2,300 horsepower is still pretty good, but when it goes into war emergency power, which the Navy was calling combat power at this point, the water injection kicks on and it allows a maximum of around 70 inches of manifold pressure and around 2,750 horsepower. I'll show the difference this makes in speed later on. It's very eye-opening. For now, we're still talking about weight. Now you might say, what does this have to do with weight? An R2800 engine is an R2800 engine as far as weight is concerned. True, they may vary a little bit in weight from one dash number to another, but not much. The weight savings in the case of the Bearcat is in what they did not add to the engine. The Bearcat has no second stage supercharger and associated drive mechanism. Now you might initially think that's crazy. The Wildcat, Hellcat, Corsair, Spitfire Mark IX, Thunderbolt, Lightning, all had 2 stages of supercharging. A single stage system is very 1937 and would normally be thought of as hopelessly obsolete in 1945-46. However, as with all this stuff, it's just not that simple. By the way, if you haven't already seen it, you may want to watch this video. It covers all the basics of these different supercharging systems. I can't really go over all the fine points of these systems in every single video I make, so I assume, for the sake of brevity in these videos, that the typical viewer here has already seen this video, or maybe my P47 series, which also lays the groundwork for all the subjects I tend to cover on this channel. If you didn't watch those other videos, then for now, just know that multiple stages of supercharging allows for more power through a greater altitude range than a single stage system. So why a single stage system in the Bearcat? Well, it's quite simple. By 1943, it had become pretty obvious that almost all naval air combat was taking place below 20,000 feet. Attacking aircraft would have to come down well below that to attack ships, so there just wasn't much need for naval fighters to have a lot of high altitude performance. But they didn't know that when they designed the Wildcat and the Corsair. At that time, there was concern that level bombers would be able to attack ships at sea from very high altitudes, 25,000 feet or so. That very rarely happened, and the Axis didn't have any bombers that could do it anyway. By the time the Bearcat's development was underway, understanding of naval air combat had evolved. Why add the weight of a second stage system if you wouldn't ever use it? Now, if Bearcats had to fly over Germany or escort B-17s, this would have been foolish. But it didn't have the range to do that anyway, so why bother with the second stage supercharger? Instead, save a bit of space and weight. Now, if you don't have a second stage, what else don't you have? Well, you don't have an intercooler, and that's by definition, because an intercooler is defined as a charged cooler between the stages. Now, you could possibly have an aftercooler, but I don't know of any radial engine that did, and the Bearcat doesn't have one anyway. Note that today in the automotive world, people call aftercoolers intercoolers. Don't let that confuse you. The point is that the Bearcat has neither. What it does have is a good water injection system with a 16-gallon tank. Let's take a look at the speed chart here. Line number 5 is for maximum continuous power, and it shows 307 knots at sea level. Line 4 is for combat power, 331 knots at sea level. Line 2 is for war emergency power, and they kept changing these times. Just know that, or the names of these power settings, just know that line 2 is all out, which means the water injection is spraying, and we can reach 366 knots, which is 421 miles per hour, or if using the metric system, 678 kilometers per hour. That's massively fast for a World War II era airplane at sea level. Now as we climb, the engine loses power. At around 12 to 13,000 feet, the pilot will switch the supercharger over to high speed to regain some of that lost power. Once the plane is above 20,000 feet, it's down below 1,500 horsepower, remember from 2,750, and power will continue to decrease as the plane climbs. Nothing can be done about it because there's only one stage and 2 speeds on the Bearcat's Dash 1 engine. Now we should note that at 25,000 feet, even though power's down, it's still pretty fast. 365 knots is about 420 miles an hour. So it's not amazing up there, but it's not exactly slow. However, it should be clear that that The plane is optimized to be a low-altitude fighter. Below 15,000 feet, it's a monster. But to get that performance, they sacrificed quite a bit up high. In fact, up at 25,000 feet, many run-of-the-mill 1944 fighters are just as fast, and most 1946 superprops will outrun it up there with ease. Of course, the airframe contributes to the speed as well. If you walk up behind the previous fighter from Grumman, the Hellcat, especially if you were just looking at, say, a P-47 or a Corsair, the Hellcat looks like it was built by a boilerplate manufacturer who made parts for ships or locomotives. There are raised rivets all over the place. Then you might notice that instead of using compound curved panels, they just used a bunch of small flat panels and attached them with a zillion raised rivets. Look at the fuselage here, especially above the insignia, and you should be able to see what I mean. This is in stark contrast to a Corsair with its complex compound curves and flush surfaces pretty much everywhere. But then when you walk around to the front of the Hellcat, you might notice a big difference. There was a method to Grumman's madness. Now the surfaces all have nice curves and everything is flush. Grumman understood the law of diminishing returns, and they really applied it to the Hellcat. They made everything flush where it counted the most. Then where it didn't, they focused on ease and speed of construction. This worked. The Hellcat performed well, and as I pointed out, was relatively inexpensive. However, the Bearcat is not like this. It's more like the Corsair. It's flush riveted and spot welded everywhere. It's a very smooth airplane. Of course, this drove cost way up, but they were clearly trying to get all the low altitude performance out of it they could. Law of diminishing returns be damned. Take a look at the front of the Hellcat. The lower part of the cowling has 3 inlets. The center is for carb air and oil cooling. The outer pair are for intercooling. In almost every test, Hellcats failed to make their rated levels of power with the engine installed in the airplane, and I think these inlets are a big part of that. I talk about that in another video which covers the Corsair and Hellcat performance in relation to each other in quite a bit of detail, so I'm not going to rehash that here. But just know that the Hellcat's air inlets and chunky fuselage cost a little bit of power and added quite a bit of drag, but simplified construction as compared with the Corsair. The Corsair had its oil cooler, carb, and intercooling air inlets in the leading edges of the wing roots. Normally, the later Corsairs with more power moved the carb air to the cowl because they simply needed more air than they could get through the wing root inlets. But in the pre-4 Corsairs, it was all through the wing roots. This is more complex to design and build, but superior. Now guess how they did it in the Bearcat. They're in the wing roots like the Corsair and unlike the Hellcat. That contributes to the Bearcat's more sleek fuselage. They provide ram air to the injection carb and those inlets, that is. On the Bearcat, they provide ram air to the injection carb and cooling air to the oil coolers. Of course, since there are no intercoolers, those inlets can be pretty small on the Bearcat. That's another downside to intercooling. It's not just the weight, it's the drag. Normally, it's worth the weight and drag penalty, especially up at high altitudes where indicated airspeed and parasite drag are low for a given true airspeed. And discharge temperatures from the supercharger, which has to work really high at high altitude, discharge temps are very high under those conditions, so an intercooler does extra good. However, the Bearcat isn't designed for fighting up there. And at low altitude, its water injection does the job of anti-knock protection really well. So down low, it has all the power of the intercooled engines, but without the extra cooling drag. And of course, that extra cooling drag is an even bigger penalty at low altitudes than it is up high because of the extra parasite drag at the high indicated speeds down low. Now, the rest of the plane has some factors that made it lightweight. For example, I actually think they saved weight by going with lighter brakes. A carrier airplane can get away with minimal wheel brakes because they rely on the arresting gear to stop the airplane. Brakes work by changing the motion of the airplane into heat. Smaller brakes have less area to absorb the heat, thus they get hotter. Bearcats did suffer from brake fires, which indicates to me that they saved weight by going with really small brakes and took the concept maybe just a bit too far. The next thing I'm going to talk about is a weight savings technique that I think was just crazy. To create a lightweight structure, the Bearcat's wings had to be a bit weaker than normal. The plane's maximum G loading, according to this chart from the pilot's manual, was about 6.3 G. Some sources put the limit at 7.5. This chart shows 6.3. Either way, it's generally lower than other World War II era fighters. Most could pull 9 Gs or slightly more than the pilot could handle before blacking out. In the Bearcat, the G limit was below the point at which the pilot would likely black out. However, it gets worse. Because the G limit is much lower if the ailerons are used, this is from the manual, quote, "The maximum acceleration of 4.5 G applies to aileron operation when flying without external stores," unquote. I'll highlight the G limit lines for you here in blue. So if you're planning to use your ailerons during a turn fight, you have to keep the G loading below 4.5 while doing so. Have fun trying to beat someone in scissors maneuvering at high speeds in a Bearcat. These G limits are a big deal because turn performance at high speeds is G limited, and the Bearcat's lower limit means that nearly all other World War II era fighters can outturn the Bearcat at high speeds. Now at low speeds, that's not the case. And in terms of sustained turn performance, the Bearcat is going to be at or near the top of the list. But in turn performance at high speeds, generally above 250 knots, the Bearcat's turn performance is subpar. However, it's about to get worse. That's not even the crazy part. So let's suppose you're an engineer at Grumman. You know your new fighter has a low G limit, so low that pilots are likely to exceed it. How would you solve this problem? I can almost guarantee that whatever solution you're thinking of isn't what Grumman did. They knew that wing failures due to over-G would happen, so they designed the wings to break off in such a way that the plane would still be flyable. The wingtips would break off at a point about here. This would leave the plane with enough wing and aileron to limp back to base and land. In the near-perfect world of mathematics and engineering, both tips would break off at the same time. In the real world, with production tolerances and asymmetrical loading of things in flight, they often didn't break off at the same time. Sometimes only one would break off, rendering the aircraft very difficult, if not impossible, to control. Now, when do you think this might have happened? If you guess at low altitudes during pullouts from dives, you guessed right. It happened when pilots would have so little time to deal with it that regaining control of the airplane would be difficult or impossible. In fact, when the Blue Angels flew Bearcats, they had just such a failure during a demonstration and the pilot was killed. So I'll ask you again, if you were an engineer at Grumman, and at this point it had become clear that Bearcats were crashing because the wingtips were breaking off individually and not in pairs as designed, how would you address the problem? Well, you might decide to strengthen the wings at this point, but Grumman's answer was to double down on this breakaway plan. They decided to link both wingtips to explosive charges so that when one wingtip broke off, explosives made sure the other one separated as well, and voila, no asymmetry, at least not in theory. That didn't work either. Asymmetry was still a problem due to system malfunctions, and at some point the explosives went off with a plane parked on the ground and it killed somebody nearby. At this point, reason returned to Grumman and they decided to abandon the whole idea. They strengthened the wings and did away with the breakaway wingtips. The manual isn't clear about this, but I think at this point the plane was cleared up to 7.5 Gs, which was a reasonable limit, pretty normal for a naval fighter. Of course, the plane gained weight, about 250 pounds. So yes, all this insanity was in an effort to save about 250 pounds, most of it involving strengthening in the area of the wing folding mechanism. On the subject of wing folding, for the Bearcat, Grumman abandoned their patented stow wing folding system, famously used on earlier airplanes like the Avenger, which resulted in the Bearcat taking up more space laterally than the much larger Grumman Avenger. But they really had to do that because the farther out you move the folding mechanism, the less stress it takes from the G-loading, and remember, they were trying really hard here to build a lightweight structure. Of course, this also helped with the landing gear problem. The Bearcat uses a pretty complex inward retracting landing gear, It's a quasi-telescoping type. It sort of unfolds on itself as it extends to gain some extra length so the giant Aero Products propeller will clear the ground. On the subject of that prop, it was selected because the Aero Products prop was lighter than the Curtiss or Hamilton standard constant speed units. Now, the Bearcat's most outstanding performance feature by far is its rate of climb. The early Dash 1 planes at war emergency power had a climb rate at sea level of 5,600 feet per minute. The rate would decrease to around 4,200 feet per minute at 8,000 feet, which was still pretty good. So good, in fact, that the Bearcats held the record for time to 10,000 feet for about 10 years. During that time, jets were trying to beat it, but could never quite match the Bearcat's 94-second time to 10,000 feet. That's an average climb rate from brake release to 10,000 feet of 6,400 feet per minute. Now, you might notice that the official climb rates for the plane don't support such a fast time to 10,000 feet. That's because when manufacturers go after these climb records, they usually use specially set up airplanes. Grumman certainly did that as well. It's said that Grumman used a production Dash 1 Bearcat for these tests. Of course, nobody says what they did to the production plane before the tests. I'm not even so sure it was a Bearcat. They may have used what was technically a Grumman Golf Hawk. The Golf Hawk was a civilian version of the Bearcat. Yeah, there was such a thing. It was built with no guns, no armor, and almost certainly no self-sealing fuel tank. I'm not sure if that's what they did for these records, and only 2 Golf Hawks were built. But in any case, it was clearly, if not a Golf Hawk, a specially prepared production Bearcat that set the climb record. I suspect the weapons and armor were removed at the least. Just to further confuse things, though, Golf Hawks were almost always, well, the 2 of them, were almost always referred to as Bearcats. And there was another earlier Grumman airplane called the Golf Hawk. Golf Hawk or specially prepared Bearcat, either way, you might be asking why the jets had such a tough time beating the Bearcat's climb record. I mean, for a record to last 10 years, back then, that was a huge amount of time. Well, I suggest watching my video on the F-14 Tomcat's horsepower. The short version is that rate of climb is a function of power available minus power required, and the faster a jet goes, the more power it has, which in itself is a pretty complex subject. So, to reach their best climb speeds, jets have to accelerate quite a bit. Keep in mind, we're talking about rate of climb, not angle of climb. Now, propeller airplanes have their best rate of climb speeds quite low. So almost right after takeoff, right after liftoff, the Bearcat can start heading up to 10,000 feet at its best rate. The jet has to accelerate for a while to reach its optimal speed. During that time, the Bearcat gets in the lead and the jet just can't catch up until the race is over at 10,000 feet. They kept announcing these Bearcat versus jet contests in period publications. Yet those same publications never published the results of these contests after they happened in their subsequent issues. I think that's because they were expecting the new jets to win, and it may have been embarrassing for their biggest advertisers that the Bearcat kept beating the new jets. On this particular page, I think it's a funny coincidence that the page opposite has an ad for sodium-filled valves. The Bearcat does have sodium-filled valves, although I have no idea if they were made by Eaton or not. Now, I must say that the Bearcat beating the jets in these contests was partially a function of the way the contests were held. They went from brake released on a runway to 10,000 feet. That's how they had been doing it since before the jet age, and I think that's still how they do it. And it does make sense to do it that way, but had these contests been done in almost any other way, the jets would have beaten the Bearcat from fairly early on. For example, if both planes were starting from cruise speed or from maximum speed, or even with both planes at the same speed, say 300 knots, the jets would have taken that record much earlier. This is really a question of that power versus thrust equation I explained in at least 2 other videos, so no need to cover it here. I should mention that a lot of these period magazines, including some of those in this video, as well as the Bearcat's pilot manual and some other U.S. Navy Bearcat data, are in the Patreon section. So if you want to do more research on this or just read the same stuff in its entirety from the original source, I've made it pretty easy for you. Now let's move on and cover the changes for the Bearcat-2 variant. I'm not going to break down every sub-variant. Frankly, I think that would be a little bit dull. I'm going to generalize here. The Dash 2s usually have the following upgrades, although some of these features can be found on certain Dash 1 subvariants. There's some crossover here. So again, generally speaking, the Dash 2s have quad 20mm cannons instead of the quad 50 calibers often found on Dash 1s. Quad 20s were a huge upgrade, as the quad 50s were so 1942 and not really up to the job anymore. The Dash 2s also have a taller vertical stabilizer and rudder. Personally, I find this really hard to see in pictures. When I look at two pictures side by side, I can kind of see it if their angle is right from the side. But in any case, the size and shape of these things in the Dash 2 is a bit different. In this magazine from January of 1949, it said that the bigger vertical stab and rudder were related to the upgrade to the 20mm cannons. Keep in mind that while these trade publications are technically primary sources, they are not 100% reliable and certainly not equal to official Navy or Grumman documents. But I include the magazine stuff sometimes because it's interesting, and often it's the only way to date certain events. Speaking of dates, I'm not sure when the Bearcats all had the strengthened wing. The Blue Angels Bearcat crash was in 1946, so I imagine the wing improvements happened shortly after that. The Dash 2s came out in 1948, so I strongly suspect all the Dash 2s were built initially from the factory with the stronger wing. The big change for the Dash 2 was the engine. It had the Pratt & Whitney R2800-30. Like the engine in the Dash 1, it runs a single-stage supercharger, no intercooler but water injection. Instead of the dual-speed supercharger, though, it uses a variable-speed drive unit. The Dash 2's engine also features an automatic engine control unit, usually called an AEC. In principle, it's a bit like the German systems used during World War II. This is an engine management system that reduced pilot workload. The throttle, which was called the boost control lever on an AEC-equipped Bearcat, which again is just some of the Dash 2s, that was used to set manifold pressure values. Say you set it at 42 inches, and when climbing or descending, the system would use the hydraulic coupling of the variable speed supercharger to maintain the manifold pressure setting. In other words, when climbing or descending, the pilot didn't have to constantly adjust the throttle lever, aka boost control lever, in order to maintain a given manifold pressure value. It had other workload reducing functions as well. For example, in many cases the pilot could adjust engine RPM without having to move the throttle first or vice versa. This is all very similar to what was in the 109 and to an extent the FW190s. Dash 2 Bearcats with the AEC would not have supercharger speed controls on the instrument panel, as supercharger compressor speed was controlled by the AEC via the supercharger's hydraulic coupling. The Dash 1s did have a supercharger speed control in the cockpit. In those planes, the pilot had to shift the supercharger speeds manually from high to low. Now, the Dash 2s without AEC had a 3-position supercharger switch marked low, intermediate, and high. But the Dash 2 with AEC, and I know this is a bit confusing, but the Dash 2 with AEC, which also means it had a variable speed supercharger drive mechanism, had what was essentially like what the Germans had been using on the BF-109, a single-stage system with a variable speed drive. I have an entire video about the 109's supercharger speed control, and it's kind of funny to me that the anti-109 crowd often criticizes the system, saying that if variable speed drive was so great, why didn't the Allies copy it? Well, they did. The later Bearcats used it, the XP-72 used it, and the later Corsairs used it. It was superior. It just took a while to adapt that technology to U.S. engines. Of course, there is a penalty in drive cost for the variable speed supercharger, so in some ranges it costs you a bit of power, but throughout the altitude range it provides an overall advantage, which is why it was used. The Dash 2s with AEC have 2,500 horsepower at war emergency, so that's 250 less than the Dash 1s, but they do it with a bit less manifold pressure, and still have more power throughout the altitude range in spite of having 250 less peak horsepower. Of course, the Dash 2s are also heavier, about 330 pounds heavier. That's not too much, but it's not nothing either. Let's graph the speeds of these two planes side by side, the Dash 1 versus the Dash 2 with the 30W engine and AEC. The green line shows speed for the Dash 1, the orange line is for the Dash 2. As you can see, the extra power of the earlier Dash 1 version's engine, plus less drag from the smaller tail, and to a very small extent the lower weight, all combine to make the original variant quite a bit faster down at sea level, at least based on the test data that's available. However, from about 9,000 feet on up, it's all Dash 2. That variable speed supercharger pays big dividends. Note that on the actual Navy chart for the Dash 2, that line has a bit of a more smooth curve to it due to the variable speed drive. I'll post the original chart at the end of the video. My graph skills are not all that great, but this chart is accurate to within about 2 knots of the original anywhere on it, and of course this makes it easier to do side-by-side comparisons. So, yes, the Bearcat was influenced by Japanese fighter, sure, in the sense that keeping weight down was a priority. However, I would say that the plane's construction and drag reduction techniques are very much like a Corsair. Its supercharging system, that is to say its single stage system with no charge cooling and driven by a variable speed hydraulic coupling backed up by water injection, is very much BF-109. Also, the Bearcat uses a single spar wing design, also very BF-109. I suppose there's some FW-190 influence in there as well, at least in terms of the plane's general layout. In conclusion, the Bearcat was one of the first superprops. It had amazing climb performance and great speed below 20,000 feet. It was an expensive airplane and did have some real sacrifices in its design to get the weight down and the climb performance up. Some of these sacrifices paid off. Some of them, like the breakaway wings, really backfired on them. The U.S. Navy never flew this plane in combat. However, the U.S. Navy did deliver Bearcats to the French in Saigon, where the French used the plane in combat during the French Indochina War, which we later know what happened with that. Little is written in the English language about the Bearcats' performance in that war, but I don't think they saw any air-to-air combat. I could be wrong, but I haven't found a shred of evidence for that. Of course, like nearly all fighters, the Bearcat could deliver air-to-ground ordnance, but it didn't carry all that much. Furthermore, it had very short range. So it was really only useful and highly effective in that close-in fleet defense role for which it was designed. With its low-altitude speed, climb rate, and firepower, it could do that really well. But with the new jets coming in, the Bearcat's place in the U.S. Navy just didn't last very long. Bearcat's production ended in 1949. Now, the Bearcat's primary U.S. rival was the Corsair, and the Corsair was a more attractive option for most buyers. Both planes were on the way out, but the Corsair stayed in production 3 years longer, into 1952. It's hard to say just what version of the Corsair I should compare to the Bearcat. In fact, deciding what version of anything to compare to anything else is always a touchy subject. The Corsair Dash 4 was the final version to see combat during World War II, but it did see combat in the war, and the Bearcat didn't. So for comparison, I'm going to go with the Corsair Dash 5, which came out in late 1945. I'd really call it a 1946 airplane. The Corsair Dash 5 had the Pratt & Whitney 32W, which is a bit like the 30W in the Bearcat Dash 2 because both are R2800s and both use the variable speed supercharger drive. However, the Corsair's supercharger is a 2-stage unit and it's intercooled. Interestingly, the only picture I can find of the 32W engine shows that it drives the extra stage at a 90-degree angle to the crankshaft. How German of them. I'm not sure if it was actually set up like that in the Corsair or not. I haven't been able to find a left side picture of the Corsair Dash 5 with the cowling off. Now you can probably guess what's going to happen when we add the Corsair Dash 5 speed to our chart. Here you go. Sure, the Bearcat is a lot lighter, but that 2-stage and intercooled supercharger setup in the Corsair just dominates the Bearcat, except against the Dash 1 version when down below 6,000 feet. Furthermore, the Corsair can carry far more ordnance, has a lot more range, has a much larger water injection tank so it can run at those higher power levels longer. During World War II, one of the Corsair's biggest faults was its horribly non-user-friendly cockpit. I'm not going to say it had the worst cockpit of World War II fighters because there is some real competition for that title, but it was really bad. But starting with the Dash 5, they fixed it and it became really good, about equal to the P-51 or maybe even the FW-190, and that's saying a lot. I don't want to turn this into a Corsair Dash 5 video, and that's not even the last or greatest Corsair, but I think that the comparison shows that the Bearcat was awesome within the confines of its very specific fleet defense mission, but in the big picture it really couldn't compete with the contemporary Corsairs. In fact, they kept Hellcats around because after the Bearcats were in service because of the range issue. I would argue that while the Bearcat may have been one of the first superprops, well, it was one of the first ones, but it just didn't have enough capability to be called the best one. However, Grumman had another superprop to throw into the ring, and the British had several. So we're going to see how those stack up in future episodes on this channel. The British sleeve valve technology was really starting to mature in the superprop era, so there are going to be some interesting comparisons coming on this channel. Thanks for watching, and extra thanks to my subscribers. I really appreciate you guys. I appreciate all the comments, and especially I've got to give thanks to my supporters on Patreon. They're really the ones paying for this channel and driving the direction it goes. Patreon supporters, of course, get early access to the videos. That way I don't miss their comments. And they get access to the original source documents used in the production of the various videos on this channel. That's all for now. Have a great day. Goodbye.